Three infants were born on the same night in Henry County, Virginia in April 1802. Three identical cries pierced the darkness of a plantation house, but only two children would be acknowledged by their mother. The third, darker skinned than his siblings by what witnesses described as no more than a shade of summer sun, vanished from all family records within hours of his birth. What happened in that delivery room has remained buried in courthouse documents, private letters, and the whispered testimonies of enslaved women for over 2 centuries. Local authorities never investigated. The family's name was scrubbed from most historical accounts. Tonight, we piece together what really happened when Margaret Fairmont gave birth to triplets and made a decision that would destroy everyone involved. Before we continue with the story of the Fairmont plantation and the night that changed everything, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, the ones hidden in dusty archives and forbidden family histories, don't get told anywhere else. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where my audience is discovering these dark chapters of American history. Now, let's go back to Virginia in 1802, to a world where appearances meant survival, and one woman's fear would seal the fate of her own child. The spring of 1802 brought more than just warm weather to the tobacco plantations along the James River. Henry County sprawled across the rolling hills of central Virginia, a patchwork of plantation estates where fortunes rose and fell with each tobacco harvest. The Fairmont plantation occupied nearly 800 acres of prime, river-bottom land worked by 43 enslaved people whose labor had built the family's wealth over 3 generations. The main house stood on a gentle rise, a 2-story brick structure with white columns that could be seen from the river road, announcing prosperity to anyone who passed. Margaret Fairmont had arrived at this house 6 years earlier as a bride of 17, brought from her family's smaller estate in Williamsburg. She was the youngest daughter of the Sutherland family, a lineage that traced itself back to English nobility, a fact that Margaret's mother mentioned in every conversation. The marriage to Thomas Fairmont had been celebrated as a perfect match. Old money meeting established land, beauty paired with respectability. Thomas, 15 years Margaret Sr., ran his plantation with the methodical attention of a man who had inherited responsibility young and taken it seriously. But by 1802, that carefully constructed image had begun to show cracks that only those inside the house could see. Margaret had suffered 2 miscarriages in her first 3 years of marriage. The first had been mourned quietly. The second had sent her into a period of melancholy that lasted through an entire winter, during which she rarely left her bedroom. Thomas had grown distant, spending more time inspecting fields and riding to Richmond on business that seemed to multiply. The pressure for an heir weighed on them both, though it was Margaret who felt it most acutely. Her mother's letters arrived weekly, each one containing some reference to cousins who had produced children, neighbors whose families were growing, the natural duty of a wife to secure her husband's legacy. When Margaret finally conceived again in the summer of 1801, the entire household seemed to exhale. Thomas became attentive once more. Margaret's mother visited and pronounced the pregnancy blessed. The enslaved women who worked in the house prepared the nursery with unusual care, perhaps sensing that this child represented something more than just another birth. What no one anticipated was that Margaret carried not 1 child but 3. The realization came late in the pregnancy. Dr. Edmund Yancey, who attended to the wealthier families in the county, had examined Margaret in February and detected what he described as unusual movement, suggesting multiple quickening. A second examination in March confirmed his suspicion. Margaret would deliver twins, possibly triplets. The news sent Margaret into a state that alternated between elation and terror. Thomas received the information with quiet satisfaction, already calculating the advantage of multiple heirs. But Margaret knew what others didn't, what she had never told anyone, not even her husband. She had reason to fear what these children might look like. Among the enslaved workers at Fairmont Plantation was a woman named Esther, who had been born on the property 28 years earlier. Esther worked primarily in the main house, attending to the more delicate tasks that Thomas's mother had trained her for before her death. She moved through the rooms with the near-invisible efficiency that was expected of her, present when needed and forgotten when not. Esther had given birth to 2 children herself, though neither had survived past infancy, a tragedy so common among enslaved families that it barely registered in the plantation records beyond a notation of increase, followed by decrease in Thomas's ledger books. Margaret had developed an unusual dependence on Esther during her pregnancy. She insisted that Esther, not the younger house girls, attend to her in the mornings. She wanted Esther present when Dr. Yancey visited. She created reasons for Esther to sleep in the small servant's room adjacent to the master bedroom, claiming she needed assistance during the night. Thomas found this arrangement peculiar, but said nothing. A pregnant woman's whims were to be indulged, and if having Esther nearby provided comfort, so be it. What Thomas didn't know, what Margaret prayed he would never discover, was that his absence from the plantation the previous summer had not gone as unnoticed as he believed. In July of 1801, Thomas had traveled to Williamsburg for 3 weeks to settle a complicated estate matter involving his mother's family. The trip had been planned for months. Margaret had remained at the plantation, claiming the summer heat made travel impossible in her delicate condition, though she wasn't yet showing. During those weeks, the house had felt different, quieter. Margaret had spent more time out of her room, walking the grounds in the early morning, taking tea on the back veranda, where she could see the workers in the distant fields. There were 19 enslaved men working the Fairmont plantation that summer. Most were assigned to the tobacco fields, some to the stables, a few to skilled positions as carpenters or blacksmiths. Among them was a man named William, who had been purchased 3 years earlier from a plantation in Maryland after Thomas needed additional skilled labor. William was a carpenter by training, capable of the fine detail work that the plantation occasionally required. He was also noticeably lighter-skinned than most of the enslaved population at Fairmont, the son of a white overseer and an enslaved woman, a fact that was noted in his sale documents but never discussed openly. What happened between Margaret and William during Thomas's absence was never recorded in any letter, never mentioned in any document. But 9 months later, as Margaret's labor began, on the night of April 23, 1802, she knew there was a possibility, small perhaps, but real, that her children might reveal a truth that would destroy her life. The labor started just after sunset. Margaret's water broke while she was at dinner, sending the household into controlled chaos. Thomas immediately sent for Dr. Yancey. Though the doctor lived 8 miles away and might not arrive for hours, Esther was summoned to Margaret's bedroom along with another enslaved woman named Ruth, who had experience with difficult births. Thomas paced the downstairs hallway as men of his position were expected to do drinking brandy and waiting for news. In the bedroom, Margaret's fear manifested as something close to hysteria. She gripped Esther's hand with painful force, her eyes wide and desperate. Between contractions, she whispered things that made no sense to Ruth but caused Esther's expression to harden into something unreadable. "You have to help me," Margaret gasped, her face slick with sweat. "Whatever happens, you have to help me. Promise?" "Me. Promise." Esther nodded slowly, understanding something that Ruth did not. The first child arrived just before midnight, a boy healthy and screaming with impressive strength. Ruth wrapped him in clean linen and placed him in the cradle that had been prepared. Thomas was called upstairs to see his son, his face breaking into a genuine smile for the first time in months. He stayed only briefly before returning downstairs, giving the women space to work. The second child came an hour later. Another boy, slightly smaller than the first, but equally vigorous. Thomas was called again, his satisfaction now mixed with bewilderment at his sudden abundance of heirs. "Is that all?" he asked Dr. Yancey, who had arrived just as the second child was born. "There may be a third," Dr. Yancey said, examining Margaret. "The labor continues." The third child entered the world at 2:17 in the morning. Ruth received him in her experienced hands, and for a moment the room fell into a silence that had nothing to do with the completion of birth. The infant was noticeably darker than his brothers, not dramatically so. His skin had the tone of someone who had spent a summer in the sun, perhaps, or carried Mediterranean blood, but the difference was unmistakable. Where his brothers were pink and pale, This child had a golden brown hue that would darken further as he grew. His features, too, seemed subtly different, though he was unmistakably related to his siblings. Margaret saw him and made a sound that was half sob, half whimper. Her worst fear had manifested in flesh and blood. Dr. Yancey frowned, leaning closer to examine the child. Ruth looked between the three infants, her confusion evident, but Esther moved with sudden purpose, taking the child from Ruth's hands. "Miss Margaret needs rest," Esther said firmly. "Too much blood lost. Dr. Yancey, you should prepare some tonic. Ruth, fetch fresh linens from the chest downstairs." Her tone carried enough authority that both Ruth and the doctor responded automatically. In the brief moment when they turned away, Esther met Margaret's eyes. Something passed between them. An understanding, a transaction, a conspiracy. "The third child is weak," Esther said clearly, loud enough for Dr. Yancey to hear as he mixed his tonic, breathing poorly. "May not survive the night." Dr. Yancey turned back, observed the child in Esther's arms. The infant was in fact crying lustily. But Esther held him in a way that muffled the sound against her body. In the dim candlelight, with everyone exhausted and distracted, it was possible to believe what Esther said. "Common with triplets," Dr. Yancey muttered. "The third often fails to thrive." Thomas was not called upstairs to see his third son. Instead, Dr. Yancey went down and delivered the news that while 2 healthy boys had been born, a third had arrived weak and would likely not survive until morning. Thomas received this information with a mixture of disappointment and philosophical acceptance. 2 heirs were more than most men could claim. If God chose to take the third, well, perhaps it was for the best. Triplets were difficult to explain anyway, almost unnatural. 2 sons presented a cleaner legacy. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the house had settled. Dr. Yancey left instructions for Margaret's care and departed. Thomas, exhausted and drunk on celebration and brandy, fell asleep in his study. Ruth returned to the servants' quarters. Only Esther remained in Margaret's room, the third infant in her arms. "What will you do?" Margaret whispered, her voice. "What you ask me to do," Esther replied. "Hide him. He can't stay here. Thomas can't see him. No one can know. I understand. You'll take care of it." Margaret's eyes were feverish, desperate. "You'll make sure? You promise?" Esther looked down at the child in her arms. He had fallen asleep, his small chest rising and falling with the perfect rhythm of healthy life. She had held her own children like this for the brief time they had lived. She knew the weight of an infant, the vulnerability of new life. "Yes," Esther said quietly, "I promise." What Esther did in the hours that followed would haunt Henrico County for generations. The plantation stretched out in the darkness, a landscape of shadows and shapes that Esther knew by heart. She had walked these paths her entire life, knew every building, every tree, every place where someone could see or not see. She moved through the night with the infant wrapped against her body, hidden beneath her shawl. Her first destination was the small cabin she shared with 3 other unmarried women from the plantation. But as she approached, she saw a lamplight still burning inside. Someone was awake, waiting. Esther changed direction. The plantation had dozens of outbuildings, tobacco barns, storage sheds, workshops, smokas. Most were locked at night, but Esther knew which ones weren't. She found herself at the old dairy house, a small stone structure that had been replaced by a newer, larger building the previous year. The old dairy was still used occasionally for storage, but mostly it sat empty. Esther slipped inside. The space smelled of damp stone and old milk, not unpleasant. She could hear mice in the walls, the sound of something dripping from a loose roof board. The infant stirred against her chest, but didn't wake. She stood there in the darkness, holding a child that wasn't hers, but somehow was her responsibility. Margaret's whispered words echoed in her mind. "Hide him. Make sure no one knows." You promised. But what did Margaret think would happen? Did she imagine Esther could simply make a newborn infant disappear? Did she expect Esther to do what couldn't be spoken aloud? The possibility hung in the air like the smell of stone and shadow. Esther knew what some women did when faced with impossible choices. She had seen it before, whispered about it in the quarters, infants who failed to thrive, children who took sick, sudden births that went wrong in convenient ways. The plantation buried small bodies regularly, the deaths noted in ledger books and forgotten by morning. One more would barely be noticed. She could do it. Smother him with a cloth, his death quick and quiet. Leave him here in the old dairy. Claim he had died in the night as Dr. Yancey predicted. Margaret would be relieved. Thomas would never know. The secret would die with the child, buried in the family cemetery with all the other unnamed infants. Esther looked down at the sleeping face. In the darkness, she couldn't see his skin color. He was just a baby, just a child who happened to be born into circumstances beyond his control. She thought of her own children, both dead before their first year. She thought of the choice Margaret had, the power to decide which of her children deserved life and which deserved erasure. She thought of the fact that Margaret's decision had been based not on the child's health or strength or prospects, but purely on the shade of his skin, evidence of a betrayal that Margaret herself had engineered, but now wanted to erase. Esther made a decision that was both mercy and revenge. She left the old dairy and walked deeper into the plantation's territory, past the working buildings into the area where the enslaved families lived. The cabins here were arranged in rough rows, each housing multiple families in cramped quarters. Esther approached one cabin at the far end, smaller than the others, where a woman lived alone. Dinah was 53 years old, ancient by plantation standards. She had worked in the tobacco fields until her hands became too gnarled with arthritis. And now she existed in a strange limbo, too old to work, too healthy to be dismissed as completely useless. She mended clothing, prepared herbs for the sick, watched over children when their parents worked. She had outlived 2 husbands and 4 children, her survival a mystery even to herself. Esther knocked softly. Danina opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been expecting someone. "You have something that needs hiding," Danina said. Not a question. Her eyes moved to the bundle in Esther's arms. Miss Margaret's 3rd child. Born different from the others. Danina's expression didn't change. She had seen too much in 5 decades to be surprised by anything. Different how? Darker, shows his father's blood. Dina opened the door wider, and Miss Margaret don't want him. Says he's weak. Says he won't survive? But he will survive, won't he? Dina looked at Esther with eyes that seemed to see through all pretense. If someone cares for him proper, that's why I'm here. Dinah was quiet for a long moment, considering what you asking me, Esther. Spell it plain, raise him, keep him hidden. Tell people he's your grandson if anyone asks. You so old nobody questions your business anymore? And when Master Thomas sees a new child in the quarters, Master Thomas, don't come down here. None of them do, unless there's trouble. Long as the work gets done, he don't care who lives in which cabin. This was largely true. The enslaved quarters operated with a degree of autonomy born of willful ignorance on Thomas's part. He preferred to deal with a few trusted overseers rather than involve himself in the daily lives of the people he owned. Children appeared and disappeared with such frequency through birth, death, sale, or escape that tracking individual lives seemed pointless to him. You know what you're asking? Dina said quietly, raising a white man's child in secret. That's dangerous. I know. Why not just do what she wants? Make him disappear proper. Esther's jaw tightened because I won't kill a child for his mother's sin. Dina looked at the infant again, her weathered face unreadable. Finally, she reached out and took the bundle from Esther's arms. The child stirred, made a small sound, then settled against Dina's chest as if he belonged there. What's his name? Dina asked. Esther realized Margaret had never named him. He had been born and immediately designated for a racer unworthy of even that small recognition. Samuel, Esther said, choosing the first name that came to mind. Call him Samuel. Samuel, Dina repeated, testing the weight of it. All right then, Samuel it is. I'll help, Esther said. Bring food when I can, clothes, whatever he needs. This going to end bad, Dina said. But there was something almost like satisfaction in her voice, as if she enjoyed the idea of a secret this dangerous, this subversive. You know that, right? Secrets like this always end bad, maybe, but not tonight. Esther returned to the main house as dawn began to break. She found Margaret awake, eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. It's done, Esther said simply. Margaret couldn't finish the sentence. He won't be found. No one will know." Margaret closed her eyes, relief washing over her face. "Thank you. You saved me." Esther said nothing. She had not saved Margaret. She had simply relocated the problem, turned Margaret's secret into a ticking mechanism that would eventually detonate. But she'd also saved a child's life. And in the moral calculus of plantation existence, perhaps that mattered more. Downstairs, Thomas woke to the news that his third son had died during the night, as Dr. Yancey had predicted. The child's body would be buried in the family cemetery, a small grave with no marker. This was not unusual for infants who died in their first days. Such deaths were common enough that elaborate memorials seemed wasteful, except there was no body to bury. Thomas, in his grief and relief, did not question this. Dr. Yancey, when he returned to check on Margaret, accepted Esther's explanation that the child had been taken away already, a mercy to spare the mother further distress. A small coffin was prepared and buried with appropriate ceremony, witnessed by the house servants and blessed by the traveling minister who served the plantation community. Only Esther and Dina knew that the coffin held nothing but weighted stones. Just when we thought this secret was safely buried, life at Fairmont Plantation continued with a normalcy that felt almost sinister. Margaret recovered from childbirth with the two acknowledged sons, named Thomas Jr. and Henry, growing healthy and strong. But in a cabin at the edge of the quarters, a third child was learning to exist in the spaces between sight and recognition. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Samuel's first year passed in a state of precarious invisibility. Danina raised him with surprising tenderness. This woman who had outlived so many children of her own. She kept him inside her cabin during the day, brought him out only in the early morning or late evening when most people were elsewhere. When questions arose about the infant's sudden presence, Danina told a simple story. Her daughter, who had been sold away 5 years earlier to a plantation in North Carolina, had died in childbirth, and the master there had sent the child back to Dinah as an act of unexpected mercy. The story was plausible enough. Such things happened occasionally, arrangements made between plantations when circumstances demanded. Thomas never questioned it because Thomas never inquired. As long as Dinah's presence didn't disrupt work patterns, her personal situation was irrelevant to him. Esther visited Dinah's cabin regularly, bringing food, cloth for clothing, small necessities. She watched Samuel grow, saw him begin to smile, to reach for objects, to babble the meaningless sounds that eventually became words. And she watched his skin darken slightly as he aged, confirming what had been evident from birth. This child carried visible evidence of mixed ancestry that would only become more obvious with time. In the main house, Thomas Jr. and Henry thrived under Margaret's doting attention and their father's satisfaction. Thomas hired a wet nurse for the boys, then a nursery maid as they grew. He commissioned a portrait of the twins on their first birthday, the two boys sitting in matching white gowns, their pale faces and light hair captured in oils by a traveling artist from Richmond. The portrait hung in the main parlor, a declaration of lineage and legitimacy. Margaret looked at that portrait every day, and every day she thought about the third face that should have been there but wasn't. Her relationship with Esther had changed. Where before there had been a mistress's casual dependence on a favored servant, now there was something more complex, a shared conspiracy, a mutual vulnerability. Margaret could never quite meet Esther's eyes anymore. And Esther, for her part, served with an efficiency that bordered on coldness, as if maintaining emotional distance was the only way she could continue to perform the role expected of her. Thomas noticed nothing. He was busy with the endless demands of plantation management, negotiations with merchants, a brief stint in the Virginia House of Burgesses that took him to Richmond for weeks at a time. His sons were healthy, his wife had recovered, his tobacco crop was promising. Life was, by his assessment, proceeding exactly as it should. But in the quarters among the enslaved community, knowledge of Samuel's true parentage spread in the way such knowledge always spread through whispered conversations, careful observations, the kind of information that existed below the master's awareness, but was understood by everyone else. People noticed that Samuel had Esther's fierce protection despite not being her child. They noticed that Danina received better food rations than her status usually warranted. They noticed that Master Thomas's sons and Diner's supposed grandson shared certain unmistakable features. The shape of their ears, the way their hair grew, a particular curve to their jawline that became more evident as they grew. Most of the enslaved workers at Fairmont kept this knowledge to themselves, understanding that exposure would benefit no one and would likely result in horrible consequences for everyone involved. But a few saw opportunity in the information. Among them was a man named Jacob, who worked as one of Thomas's field overseers. Jacob occupied a complicated position in the plantation hierarchy. Enslaved himself, but given authority over other enslaved workers, a situation that required constant navigation of loyalty and survival. Jacob had ambitions. He wanted to be noticed, to be considered indispensable, perhaps even to purchase his freedom eventually if he could accumulate enough favor. Jacob began watching. He observed Esther's visits to Diner's cabin. He noticed how protective certain women were of the child, how they positioned themselves to block view when Thomas or his white overseers approached that section of the quarters. He noted the child's features, did the arithmetic of dates and births, and Jacob waited for the right moment to use this information. That moment came in the spring of 1804 when Samuel was 2 years old, and the resemblance between him and the Fairmont twins was becoming impossible to ignore. Jacob approached Thomas one morning as the master was inspecting a section of newly planted tobacco. "Master Fairmont, sir, might I have a word? Something you should know about, sir, concerning the family." Thomas looked up from the seedlings, mildly annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Jacob? Make it quick. It's a delicate matter, sir. Concerns Miss Margaret in a way, and the children." This got Thomas's attention. He straightened, his expression hardening. "Explain yourself." Jacob hesitated, performing reluctance. "There's a child in the quarters, sir. Old Diner's boy says he's her grandson from North Carolina. But, sir, that ain't the truth." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting, sir, that you take a look at the child yourself. Compare him to your own sons. See what you see." Thomas's face went very still. "You're making a serious implication, Jacob?" "Yes, sir." "I know it, but I thought you should know before others start talking." Thomas was not a stupid man. He could add dates and circumstances as well as anyone. He thought about Margaret's pregnancy, about the third child who had supposedly died, about the unusual amount of time his wife had spent with Esther. He thought about William, the light-skinned carpenter who had been sold away suddenly a year ago, sent to a plantation in Georgia. At the time, Thomas had justified the sale as good business. William's carpentry skills had commanded a high price. But now he wondered if there had been another reason, some instinct he hadn't fully acknowledged. "Take me to this child," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Jacob led Thomas to Diner's cabin. It was mid-morning, a time when most people were working, but Diner was old enough to be excused from field labor. She was sitting outside her cabin, and on the ground beside her, playing with a carved wooden toy, was Samuel. Thomas stopped 10 feet away, staring. The child looked up, met his gaze with eyes that were unmistakably his own. The shape of the face, the set of the shoulders, even the way the child tilted his head, all of it was familiar. Thomas saw himself in this child, saw his own sons, saw his father. The resemblance was not subtle. "Where did this child come from?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking slightly. Danina stood slowly, her arthritic joints protesting. "My grandson, sir, my daughter's boy from North Carolina." "Your daughter's been dead 8 years?" "Diner, I know, because I sold her to the Katz Plantation in 96 and they reported her death from fever in 97. So I'll ask you again. Where did this child come from?" Danina said nothing, her face carefully blank. Thomas looked at Samuel again, the child who had his face. He thought about the night Margaret gave birth, about the third son who had supposedly been too weak to survive. He thought about Esther's care of his wife, about a possibility so horrifying he had never allowed himself to consider it. "How old is this child?" Thomas demanded. 2 years, sir." "Near about born in spring of 1802. "Yes, sir." Thomas felt something crack inside him, a foundation of certainty that had supported his entire understanding of his life. He turned and walked back toward the main house, his stride becoming faster until he was nearly running. Margaret was in the morning room embroidering while the twins played nearby with their wooden soldiers. She looked up as Thomas burst in, his face flushed with rage. "Get the children out," Thomas said, his voice terrifyingly controlled. Now, the nursery maid, sensing disaster, quickly gathered the boys and fled. Margaret stood, her embroidery falling forgotten to the floor. "Thomas, what?" "Tell me about the third child," Thomas interrupted. "The one who died." Margaret's face went white. What do you mean? He was weak. He didn't survive. Don't lie to me." Thomas's shout made Margaret flinch. "I've seen him in the quarters. A 2-year-old boy who has my face." Margaret's legs gave out. She collapsed back into her chair, her hands shaking. "It's not possible," she whispered. "Esther said she promised he was gone." "Gone where, Margaret? Gone how?" Thomas grabbed his wife's shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "What did you do? What secret have you been keeping?" The whole story came out in broken pieces. Margaret's summer loneliness while Thomas was in Williamsburg. The carpenter William, who had been kind to her, who had listened when she spoke, who had made her feel less alone. The relationship that had developed in the dangerous space of her husband's absence. The pregnancy that could have been Thomas's or might have been William's. The birth of 3 sons, one of whom was too dark to acknowledge. "I was frightened," Margaret sobbed. "I didn't know what to do. I thought if anyone saw him, they would know, and it would destroy everything. You would cast me out. My family would disown me. I would lose my sons. So you gave him away." Thomas's voice was ice. "You gave away my son Margaret. Whatever else he is, he's mine, mine." This was what Margaret hadn't understood in her panic. She had seen the child as evidence of her betrayal, something to be hidden or erased. But Thomas saw him as property, as lineage, as his, regardless of the circumstances of conception. In the twisted logic of plantation society, the child was Thomas's because everything on the plantation was Thomas. The land, the tobacco, the people, the children. Margaret's infidelity was a betrayal, certainly, but it didn't change the fundamental ownership structure that governed Thomas's world. "Where is Esther?" Thomas demanded. Esther was summoned to the morning room. She came slowly, knowing what awaited her. Thomas stood by the fireplace, his fist clenched around the mantel so hard his knuckles were white. Margaret sat collapsed in her chair, no longer crying, her face blank with shock. "You took the child," Thomas said. "You were supposed to dispose of it, but you took it to Dina instead. Why?" Esther met his gaze steadily. "Miss Margaret asked me to hide him, so I hid him. She asked you to kill him." "She asked me to hide him." Esther repeated, "I did what was asked." "Don't play word games with me. You knew what she meant." "Did I, sir? I'm just a slave?" "Not sure I understand the fine points of what white folks mean when they tell me to make their problems disappear." The insolence in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas felt rage surge through him, the kind of anger that could lead to violence. But underneath the rage was something else. Awareness that Esther had power in this situation. Knowledge that could destroy his family's reputation if it spread. "You've put me in an impossible position," Thomas said finally. "That child cannot stay here. His presence is a constant reminder of my wife's betrayal, and his resemblance to my legitimate sons will cause endless speculation." "Then sell him," Esther said flatly. "Sell him away like you sell anyone else who becomes inconvenient." Margaret made a sound of protest, but Thomas ignored her. "He's 2 years old," Thomas said. "Too young to sell for a meaningful profit, and any buyer would ask questions about his parentage. The questions I can't afford to have asked." "So what will you do?" Esther asked. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "That depends on whether you can keep your mouth shut. This secret stays here between the 4 of us. Me, Margaret, you, and Dina. The child continues to live in the quarters as Dinina's grandson. No one speaks of his real parentage ever. If this information leaves this room, if there is even a whisper that reaches beyond this plantation, I will hold you personally responsible. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "I could have you whipped for this," Thomas said quietly. "For concealing information, for disobeying orders, for your insolence today." "Give me one reason I shouldn't, because then you'd have to explain why," Esther replied. "And that's a conversation you don't want to have." They stared at each other, master and slave, caught in a web of mutual compromise that inverted all the usual power dynamics. "Get out," Thomas said finally, "and send Danina to me. We need to establish some rules." Danina came to the main house, walking slowly, her face resigned. She had known this day would come eventually. Secrets this large never stayed buried forever. Thomas met her in his study, a room lined with ledgers and law books, the administrative heart of the plantation. "A child stays with you," Thomas said without preamble. "But there will be conditions. He does not come near the main house. He does not play with my sons. He does not attend lessons, does not eat at any table where he might be seen by visitors. As far as anyone from outside this plantation is concerned, he is your grandson from North Carolina. Nothing more. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "You will receive extra rations to care for him. But understand this, Diner. If he becomes a problem, if his presence causes any difficulty whatsoever, I will sell him so far away you'll never hear his name again. I'm allowing him to stay out of complicated considerations, but my patience has limits." "I understand, sir. Do you?" Thomas leaned forward. "Do you understand that this child represents the greatest shame of my life? That every time I see him, I see my wife's betrayal, that he is a living reminder of my failure to control my own household." Dina looked at him with her ancient knowing eyes. "I understand that you see shame, sir? But that child didn't choose his circumstances. He's just a boy." "He's a problem," Thomas corrected. "A problem I'm choosing not to eliminate against my better judgment. Don't make me regret that choice." Danina nodded and left, returning to her cabin where Samuel waited, unaware that his life had just been debated and conditionally spared. The weeks that followed were tense. Margaret took to her bed again, this time not with melancholy, but with a kind of desperate shame that manifested as physical illness. She saw Dr. Yanzi, who prescribed tonics and rest. She wrote letters to her mother that she never sent, trying to explain what had happened and why. Thomas threw himself into work, spending as much time away from the house as possible. He rode to Richmond frequently, attended every social function that provided an excuse for absence. He looked at his legitimate sons and tried to feel the pride he had felt before. But now their faces reminded him of another face, one that should not exist, but did. And in the quarters Samuel continued to grow, unaware of the chaos his existence had caused, protected by an old woman who had decided this was the one fight she wouldn't surrender. The arrangement Thomas had imposed might have held if plantation life existed in isolation. But no plantation was truly isolated, and secrets had a way of spreading like tobacco blight, invisible until the damage was already done. The problem began with visitors. The Fairmont plantation, like most estates of its size, regularly entertained guests, business associates, family members, neighbors from other plantations. These visits were essential to maintaining social position and business relationships. And these visitors, particularly the women, wanted to see the children. Thomas Jr. and Henry, now 4 years old, were exhibited with the kind of casual pride that came naturally to proud fathers. They were dressed in miniature versions of gentlemen's clothing, taught to bow and greet visitors with appropriate formality. Margaret, when she was well enough to receive guests, would show off their accomplishments. How Henry could recite passages from the Bible, how Thomas Jr. could identify letters and write his name. And inevitably during these visits, someone would walk through the plantation grounds. They would see the quarters, observe the workers, and sometimes they would see Samuel. The first incident occurred in the fall of 1805, when Margaret's older sister Charlotte visited from Williamsburg with her husband. Charlotte had 3 daughters and had always felt slightly superior to Margaret, whose struggle to produce heirs had been the subject of family gossip. Now, seeing the healthy twin boys, Charlotte's superiority felt threatened, and she looked for anything that might restore her sense of advantage. On the second day of her visit, Charlotte took a morning walk through the plantation grounds. It was something wealthy white women did. Inspect the quarters with the pretense of concern for the workers' welfare, though really it was just another way to assert dominance. Charlotte walked through the rows of cabins, noting their condition with critical eyes, until she came to Diner's cabin at the far end. Samuel was outside, now 3.5 years old, playing with a small carved horse that Diner had made for him. He looked up as Charlotte approached, his face curious and unafraid. Charlotte stopped walking, staring at the child. She saw Thomas's face in miniature, saw the Sutherland family features that she shared with Margaret. The child was darker than he should be, certainly, but the resemblance was undeniable. "Whose child is this?" Charlotte demanded. Dina emerged from the cabin, moving to place herself between Charlotte and Samuel. "My grandson, ma'am, from North Carolina? Your grandson?" Charlotte repeated skeptically. "How convenient. Tell me, when exactly did this grandson arrive?" 3 years back, Mom." Charlotte's mind was already working through dates and possibilities. 3 years ago was 1802, the same year Margaret had given birth. She remembered the letters Margaret had sent, announcing the twins. But there had been something odd about those letters, a strange tone Charlotte hadn't been able to identify at the time. "Take me to my sister," Charlotte said abruptly. Now, the confrontation in Margaret's sitting room was brutal. Charlotte dismissed the servants and closed the door, then turned on Margaret with an expression of mingled triumph and disgust. "There's a child in the quarters who looks exactly like Thomas," Charlotte said. "Born the same year as your twins. Would you like to explain that to me?" Margaret's face went blank, the expression of someone who had been expecting catastrophe for so long that its arrival almost felt like relief. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Margaret. I'm your sister. I can see what you've done, what I've done." Margaret's voice rose defensive. "What about what Thomas has done? All these men with their slave women producing children all over their plantations, and no one says a word." "But you're a white woman," Charlotte hissed. "It's not the same, you know, it's not the same." "Why?" "Because we're supposed to pretend our husbands are faithful while they rape the women they own. Because we're supposed to smile and ignore the children who look like our husbands running through the quarters." "That child doesn't look like Thomas," Charlotte said quietly. "He looks like your son's." "He's too light to be just a slave's child?" "Margaret, what did you do?" The full story didn't come out, not then. Margaret held on to some shred of dignity, refusing to confess everything. But Charlotte was intelligent enough to piece together the basic truth. Margaret had been unfaithful, had produced a child of mixed race, and had hidden him in the quarters rather than face the consequences. "Does Mother know?" Charlotte asked. "No, no one knows, just Thomas and the servants. This will destroy you if it gets out. Destroy all of us." "The scandal, I know," Margaret whispered. "Why do you think I've lived in terror for 3 years?" Charlotte stood, pacing the room with agitation. She had come to her sister's home, expecting a pleasant visit, perhaps some gentle chardon over Margaret's past difficulties. Instead, she had discovered a scandal that threatened the entire family's reputation. "That child cannot stay here," Charlotte said finally. "He's visible proof of your betrayal. Thomas wants him here. He considers Samuel, his son, legally his property. Samuel—" Charlotte's voice was sharp. "You named him." "I didn't. Esther did, the woman who helped." Charlotte processed this information, her expression calculating. "Then there's a simple solution. The child must disappear properly this time. He's young enough that it can be arranged quietly. An accident, an illness. These things happen all the time with slave children." Margaret felt something revolt in her, a maternal instinct that 3 years of separation hadn't entirely killed. "No, I won't. I can't. You don't have a choice. Unless you want our entire family destroyed. Unless you want your sons to grow up with everyone knowing their mother is an adulteress who produced a bastard child. Is that what you want?" The conversation continued for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. Charlotte was right. Samuel's continued existence was a threat, and Margaret, exhausted by years of fear and guilt, couldn't find the strength to fight anymore. When Thomas returned that evening, he found his wife and sister-in-law waiting for him in his study, a united front of grim determination. "We need to discuss the child," Charlotte said. "The one in the quarters." Thomas's expression darkened. "That's not your concern, Charlotte." "It is when it affects my family's reputation. Margaret has told me everything, and we agree. The child must go." "I've already made my decision about this," Thomas said coldly. "He stays under controlled conditions, but he stays." "Why?" Charlotte demanded. "Out of some misplaced sense of paternity. He's evidence of your wife's betrayal." Every day he remains here is a humiliation to you." Thomas looked at Margaret, who couldn't meet his eyes. "Is this what you want? For your son to be removed?" "He's not my son," Margaret said. But her voice broke on the words. "Not really. He can't be." "But he is," Thomas said quietly. "That's the problem, isn't it? He's mine whether I want him or not, and I don't kill what's mine." "Then sell him," Charlotte pressed, "far away, to someone who will never connect him to this family. He's 3 years old who buys a 3-year-old child. Plenty of plantations need young workers, or there are families in the city who take in children as household servants. It can be done quietly for the right price." Thomas stood silent for a long moment, wrestling with conflicting impulses. The practical part of him recognized that Charlotte was right. Samuel's presence was dangerous. But another part, the part that counted tobacco yields and tracked bloodlines, and thought in terms of property and legacy, couldn't quite accept the idea of disposing of his own son, regardless of the circumstances. "I'll consider it," Thomas said finally. "But not now. The child stays until I decide otherwise." Charlotte left 2 days later, disappointed but not defeated. She had planted the seed, and she knew Thomas was a practical man. Eventually, practicality would win. But Charlotte made one critical mistake before she left. She mentioned the situation to her husband, swearing him to secrecy. And her husband, after several glasses of port at a gentleman's club in Williamsburg, mentioned it to a business associate, and that associate mentioned it to his wife. And so the secret began its inevitable spread, leaking out in fragments and whispers, growing distorted as it passed from mouth to mouth. By the spring of 1806, rumors had reached several of the neighboring plantations. The details were confused. Some said Thomas had fathered a child with a slave woman. Others claimed Margaret had taken a lover. Still others insisted the whole thing was a lie spread by jealous competitors. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something was wrong at Fairmont Plantation. Some scandal involving children and hidden parentage. Thomas began noticing the change in how people treated him. Conversations would stop when he entered a room. Business associates were slightly cooler in their dealings. Invitations to social events became less frequent. Nothing overt, nothing he could confront directly, but a definite shift in social temperature. He knew what it meant. The secret was out, spreading like fever, destroying his reputation with every retelling. In June of 1806, Thomas made his decision. He called Denina to his study and told her to prepare Samuel for a journey. The child would be taken to Richmond and placed with a family that needed a house servant. He would be well treated, Thomas insisted, but he could no longer remain at Fairmont. Denina received this news with the kind of stillness that comes from having survived too much to show despair openly. "When, sir?" "3 days. I've already made the arrangements." Denina returned to her cabin and looked at Samuel, who was playing with his carved horses, acting out some elaborate story only he understood. He was 4 years old now, bright and curious with his father's intelligence and his mother's determination, though he would never know either of them as parents. She had raised him for 4 years. This child who wasn't hers, but had become hers through the alchemy of daily care. She had taught him to walk, to speak, to recognize plants and birds. She had told him stories at night, had held him through nightmares, had loved him in the way one loves a child who represents something more than just themselves. And now he would be taken away, sold to strangers, sent into a life she couldn't protect him from. Dina made a decision that was both desperate and calculated. That night, after Samuel fell asleep, she slipped out of the cabin and walked to Esther's quarters. Esther was awake when Denina arrived, as if she had been expecting this visit. They sat outside in the darkness, speaking in whispers that wouldn't carry to neighboring cabins. "Master's selling Samuel," Denina said, 3 days from now, taking him to Richmond. Esther's expression didn't change, but her hands clenched into fists. "I feared this was coming." "I can't let it happen," Dina said quietly. "I won't. I've lost too many children in my life." "I won't lose another one. What are you planning?" "I'm taking him away. Running." The word hung between them, heavy with consequence. Running was the ultimate transgression, the act that could result in brutal punishment or death. But it was also the only form of resistance available, the only way to truly defy the system that owned them. "You'll die if they catch you," Esther said flatly. Or worse, you know what they do to runaways? I know, but I also know what they do to children in those city houses. I've heard the stories. Samuel won't survive it. Better to try and fail than to just hand him over. You're old Diner, you won't make it 50 miles. Your joints can barely handle walking around the plantation. Then I'll make it 20 meters or 10 or 5, however far I can get before they catch me. Esther looked at her for a long moment, seeing the absolute determination in the older woman's face. You need help. I need information, routes, safe houses. You know, people, Esther, you hear things, tell me how to do this. Over the next 2 days, Esther gathered what information she could. There were networks, whispered routes, places where runaways could hide or find assistance. The networks were fragile and dangerous, as likely to lead to capture as to freedom, but they existed. Esther learned of a freed black family living 30 miles north, near the border with Maryland, who sometimes provided shelter. She learned of churches where sympathetic ministers might offer food. She learned of places to avoid areas where slave catchers were known to patrol. She passed this information to Diner in fragments. Careful conversations in moments when they wouldn't be overheard. They made plans with the thoroughness of generals planning a campaign, knowing that every detail could mean the difference between escape and capture. On the third night, the night before Samuel was scheduled to be taken to Richmond, Danina prepared to leave. She packed what little she could carry, some food, a blanket, a knife. She woke Samuel and dressed him in his warmest clothes, though he was confused and sleepy. "Where are we going, Grandma?" he asked, using the title that had become natural to him. "On an adventure," Dina said, keeping her voice light despite the fear coursing through her. "We're going to see new places." "Will we come back?" Maybe, Dina said, the lie necessary. "Maybe Sunday." They slipped out of the cabin just after midnight when most people were deeply asleep. The plantation was dark, except for a few scattered lights in the main house. Danina held Samuel's hand and moved as quickly as her old body would allow, heading not toward the road, but into the woods that bordered the eastern edge of the property. They had made it perhaps half a mile when Samuel stumbled and fell, crying out in pain. Diner helped him up, found that he had twisted his ankle on a root. He could walk but slowly, and he was starting to cry in earnest now, the adventure turning frightening. "Hush, baby," Danina whispered urgently. "We have to be quiet. It's part of the game." But the delay had cost them precious time, and Samuel's injury meant they were moving far slower than planned. By the time dawn began to break, they had covered less than 3 miles. Diner knew it wasn't enough. The alarm would be raised soon and dogs would be sent to track them. She found a thick grove of trees and pulled Samuel into it, hiding them both under the blanket and low-hanging branches. Samuel had fallen asleep again, exhausted by the night's walk. Danina held him and prayed to a God she wasn't sure listened to people like her. Back at the plantation, the alarm was indeed raised. Thomas discovered Diner's absence when he went to collect Samuel for the journey to Richmond. The empty cabin told its own story. Thomas's rage was immediate and volcanic. He called for his overseer, for the dogs, for a hunting party to be assembled immediately. "Find them," Thomas ordered. "I want that woman brought back." "And the child alive, sir?" the overseer asked. Thomas hesitated, his face contorted with conflicting emotions. "The child?" "Yes, unharmed. The woman." "Use your judgment." The hunting party set out with dogs before the sun was fully up. The hounds picked up the scent quickly, trained as they were for exactly this purpose. They followed the trail into the woods, baying with excitement at the fresh track. Danina heard the dogs and knew it was over. She woke Samuel and tried to explain, tried to prepare him for what was coming. "But how do you explain capture and consequences to a 4-year-old child?" "I need you to be brave," Danina told him, holding his face between her weathered hands. "Whatever happens, remember that I love you. Remember that you're worth more than they say you are. You understand me, Samuel. You're worth everything." Samuel nodded, not understanding, but sensing the gravity of the moment. The hunting party found them within the hour. 6 men on horseback, 2 with rifles, the dogs straining at their leashes. They surrounded the grove where Danina and Samuel hid, cutting off any possibility of further flight. "Come out," the overseer called. "It's over, Dina. Don't make this harder." Danina emerged slowly, holding Samuel's hand. The child pressed against her leg, terrified by the dogs and the men and the hostility radiating from the hunting party. "Take the boy," the overseer ordered one of the men. "No," Dina said, her voice stronger than she felt. "He stays with me. You don't get to make demands, old woman. You're a runaway. You know what that means." One of the men dismounted and moved toward them. Dina tried to step between him and Samuel, but the man was larger and stronger. He grabbed Samuel, pulling him away from Dina's protective grip. Samuel screamed, reaching for her. "Grandma, Grandma, it's all right, baby." Dina called to him, though her voice broke. "It's all right, be brave." They tied Dina's hands behind her back and forced her to walk back to the plantation. The men on horses surrounding her, the dogs following. Samuel was carried by one of the riders still crying for Dina. The walk back took hours. By the time they reached Fairmont, Dina's feet were bleeding and her old body was near collapse. But she held her head up, refusing to show weakness or regret. Thomas was waiting in front of the main house. He took Samuel from the rider, examining the child to ensure he was unharmed. Samuel had stopped crying, too exhausted and frightened to do anything but stare with wide, shocked eyes. "Take her to the barn," Thomas ordered, indicating Diner. 20 lashes, then put her in the storage cellar for 3 days. No food, water only. Diner had known this was coming, but the reality of it still hit like a physical blow. 20 lashes at her age could kill her. The overseer knew it too, hesitating briefly. "Sir, she's old, might not survive that." "Then make sure she does," Thomas said coldly. "I want her to live long enough to understand the consequences of her choices." They dragged Dina toward the barn. Samuel, seeing this, began screaming again, fighting against Thomas's grip. "Grandma, don't hurt Grandma." Thomas looked down at the child, the source of all his troubles, and felt a complicated mixture of affection and resentment. Samuel was his son, undeniably. But he was also a reminder of everything Thomas wanted to forget. Esther appeared in the doorway of the main house, drawn by the commotion. She saw Dina being taken to the barn, saw Samuel struggling in Thomas's arms, and understood that everything had gone wrong. "Master Fairmont," Esther said quietly. "Let me take the child. He's frightened." Thomas looked at her. This woman who had started all of this by choosing mercy over obedience. "You knew about this, didn't you? About Dina's plan to run?" "No, sir." "Don't lie to me, Esther. You've been helping her all along." "I gave her information, sir, that's all. I didn't know she'd actually run. Thomas could have her whipped, too. Could punish everyone involved in this conspiracy, but he was tired. So tired of this situation and all its complications." "Take him," Thomas said, handing Samuel to Esther. "Keep him in the quarters. I'll deal with all of this tomorrow." Esther took Samuel, who clung to her desperately. She carried him away from the barn, away from the sounds that were about to begin, shielding his ears and trying to provide what small comfort she could. In the barn, Dina was whipped. 20 lashes delivered with the cold efficiency of routine punishment. She screamed at first, then fell silent, conserving what strength remained. When it was done, they left her bleeding on the barn floor, too damaged to move. She would survive, barely. But Dina would never walk without pain again, and the infection from her wounds would sicken her for months. The woman who had tried to save a child through flight would spend the rest of her shortened life as a cautionary tale about the price of resistance. The attempted escape had changed everything. Thomas could no longer maintain the fiction that Samuel could remain at Fairmont under controlled conditions. The child had become too visible, his presence too controversial, his very existence a source of instability. But the scandal had also spread too far for discretion. Thomas couldn't simply sell Samuel to a family in Richmond without raising questions about why this child, who resembled the Fairmont twins so closely, was being disposed of. Any potential buyer would wonder, would speculate, would potentially spread more rumors. Thomas found himself trapped by the very secrecy he had tried to maintain. He couldn't acknowledge Samuel as his son without confirming Margaret's infidelity. But he couldn't get rid of Samuel without drawing attention to the mystery. Every option led to exposure, to shame, to the destruction of his family's reputation. He spent weeks wrestling with the problem, drinking more heavily, avoiding both Margaret and Samuel, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. The answer, when it came, arrived in the form of a letter from Charlotte. His sister-in-law had been making inquiries using her connections in Williamsburg and Richmond, seeking a way to resolve the situation quietly. She had found, she wrote, a missionary family traveling to the Western Territories, seeking to establish a church in the Ohio Valley. They were looking for children to take with them. Orphans, unwanted children, anyone who needed a fresh start far from civilization. They asked no questions about parentage. Charlotte wrote, "They care only about providing Christian education to children in need." This could be the solution you've been seeking. The child would be removed far enough that he could never return or cause embarrassment, and the family is respectable enough that you could claim, if asked, that you made a charitable gesture in supporting their mission. Thomas read the letter 3 times, considering Ohio was nearly 1,000 miles away across mountains and through territories that were barely settled. A 4-year-old child sent there would likely never return. There would be no possibility of future complications, no chance encounters, no awkward questions. Samuel would simply disappear into the vastness of the western frontier. It was, Thomas realized, the perfect solution. Not quite murder, not quite abandonment, but a permanent removal that could be framed as charity rather than cruelty. He wrote back to Charlotte immediately, accepting her suggestion. The missionary family arrived at Fairmount Plantation in early September 1806. Reverend Marcus Hayes and his wife, Elizabeth, were plain, earnest people in their 30s, driven by religious conviction to bring Christianity to the frontier. They had 2 children of their own and had agreed to take 3 additional orphans with them on their journey west. Samuel would be the 4th. Thomas met with them in his study, explaining the situation in the most favorable terms possible. "The boy is the grandson of one of my workers," Thomas said, the lie smooth and practiced. "His mother died in childbirth, and his grandmother has become too old to care for him properly. I believe he would benefit from the education and opportunities your mission could provide." Reverend Hayes nodded sympathetically. "We've encountered many such situations. Children without proper families needing guidance and Christian instruction. We're happy to include him. He has a name," Thomas added Samuel. "But you're welcome to change it if you feel it appropriate." "We'll keep his name," Elizabeth Hayes said gently. "Every child should keep that much of their identity." Thomas felt an unexpected stab of guilt at her kindness, but pushed it aside. This was the only practical solution. Samuel would have a better life in Ohio than he could ever have at Fairmount. Free from the stigma of his birth, able to make his own way in a society that wouldn't know his history, or so Thomas told himself. The day of departure came quickly. Samuel was collected from Esther's cabin. Denina was still too weak to walk, still recovering in her cabin from the whipping. Samuel didn't understand what was happening, only that he was being taken somewhere by strangers. Esther held him for a long moment before letting go, memorizing his face, knowing she would likely never see him again. "You be good," she told him. "You listen to these people, you learn everything they teach you, and you remember. You're worth just as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone tell you different." Samuel nodded, not understanding but sensing the finality of the moment. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as the missionary family's wagon prepared to leave. Samuel sitting in the back among bundles of supplies and the other orphan children. She had not said goodbye to him. She had not in fact seen him since the night of his birth, but she watched now, her hand pressed against the glass as the physical evidence of her betrayal was removed from her life. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt a hollow grief that she couldn't name for a child she had never allowed herself to claim. The wagon pulled away, heading west toward Richmond, and then beyond into territories Margaret had never seen and never would. Samuel looked back once, confused and frightened, before the trees swallowed the view, and he was gone. Thomas stood in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and told himself he had done the right thing. The practical thing, the only thing that made sense. In her cabin, Dina learned that Samuel was gone, and something inside her simply broke. She had survived too much, endured too much, fought too hard to save this one child, only to fail in the end. She stopped speaking after that day, stopped engaging with the world in any meaningful way. She lived for another 2 years, but she was never truly present. her mind retreating to some place where pain and loss couldn't follow. Esther continued her work in the main house, serving the family that had destroyed so much while pretending everything was normal. But she began keeping a journal, writing down the true story of Samuel's birth and disappearance. She hid the journal under a floorboard in her cabin. Insurance against forgetfulness, proof that these events had actually happened. Someday, she wrote in one entry, someone will want to know the truth. Someone will ask what happened to Margaret Fairmont's third child, and this journal will be here to answer. The years that followed Samuel's departure were marked by a slow decay of everything Thomas and Margaret had tried to protect. Their marriage, already damaged, deteriorated into cold coexistence. Margaret never recovered from the guilt and loss, spending most of her time in her rooms, avoiding social occasions, slowly withdrawing from the world. Thomas threw himself into plantation business with obsessive intensity, as if enough profit and productivity could compensate for personal unhappiness. Thomas Jr. and Henry grew into young men who knew something was wrong in their family but could never quite identify what. They sensed their parents' mutual misery, the unspoken secrets that hung in the air of the main house. Both boys left for education in Richmond as soon as they were old enough. Eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of Fairmont Plantation, the plantation itself began a gradual decline. Thomas made poor business decisions, invested in ventures that failed, borrowed money he couldn't easily repay. By 1815, he was forced to sell off portions of the land to satisfy debts. By 1820, the plantation was half its original size, worked by a fraction of its former enslaved population. Esther was freed in 1823, not through Thomas's generosity, but through the provisions of his mother's will, which had stipulated that certain favored servants be freed after 20 years of service. Esther was 47 years old, worn down by decades of service, but alive and legally free. She moved to Richmond, taking her hidden journal with her, and found work as a seamstress. Margaret died in 1827 at the age of 42. The doctor called it a wasting sickness, but those who knew her understood she had simply given up, exhausted by years of guilt and isolation. Her death was barely noticed outside the immediate family. She was buried in the family cemetery, not far from the empty grave that supposedly held her third son. Thomas survived her by 7 years, dying in 1834 at age 62. His obituary in the Richmond newspaper was brief, noting his service in the Virginia House of Burgesses and his management of a once prosperous plantation. It made no mention of scandal, secrets, or hidden children. His estate, diminished and deptridden, was divided between Thomas Jr. and Henry, neither of whom wanted to maintain the property. They sold it in 1836 to a land speculator who divided it into smaller farms. The Fairmont Plantation House still stands today, though it's been converted into a museum and event space. Tour guides mention the family's history during the colonial period, the plantation's role in tobacco production, the architecture of the main house. They do not mention Margaret's third child or the conspiracy that surrounded his birth or the lives destroyed to maintain a secret, because for over a century that secret remained buried. Esther's journal surfaced in 1889, discovered in a trunk of her belongings after her great-granddaughter died. The family, uncertain what to do with the explosive contents, consulted a lawyer who advised them to donate it to the Virginia Historical Society with the stipulation that it not be made public for 50 years. The journal was cataloged and stored, largely forgotten in the archives. It wasn't until 1952 that a graduate student researching plantation life stumbled across Esther's journal and recognized its significance. The story of Margaret Fairmont's triplets and the dark-skinned child who was hidden then sent away was finally revealed to historians and researchers. Attempts were made to trace Samuel's fate to find out what had happened to the child sent west with the Hayes missionary family. Records from the Ohio missions of that period were incomplete and poorly maintained. The Hayes family could be traced to Ohio Territory, where they established a small church near present-day Cincinnati. But after 1810, the records become unclear. Children died frequently on the frontier from disease, accidents, the harsh conditions of pioneer life. There is one tantalizing possibility, though nothing can be confirmed. In the 1850 census for Ohio, there is a record of a man named Samuel Hayes. Age 48, listed as a school teacher in a small frontier town. The age would be approximately correct, and the surname suggests he was raised by or adopted into the Hayes family. But without definitive proof, without any documentation linking this Samuel Hayes to the child born at Fairmont Plantation, historians can only speculate. If it was him, if he survived his childhood and built a life in Ohio, then Margaret's darkest secret had an ending she never imagined. The child she discarded as too dark, too dangerous, too damaging to her reputation might have lived a long and productive life, free from the plantation system that had condemned him at birth, able to claim an identity beyond the circumstances of his conception. Or perhaps he died young, another unnamed victim of frontier hardship, his existence and death equally invisible to history. We'll never know for certain. That's the nature of hidden histories of stories that were meant to be erased. The documentation is incomplete, the witnesses all dead, the truth obscured by time and intentional destruction of evidence. What we do know is this: 3 children were born on April 23, 1802 at Fairmont Plantation in Henry County, Virginia. 2 were acknowledged, raised as heirs, given every advantage their father's wealth could provide. 1 was hidden, sent away, erased from family records and memory. And the question that haunts this story isn't just what happened to that 3rd child. It's how many other children in how many other plantation houses were disappeared for similar reasons. How many secrets were buried under floorboards and empty graves? How many lives were destroyed not by malice but by fear? Fear of scandal, fear of social consequence, fear of acknowledging the complicated, brutal reality of plantation life. Margaret Fairmont's story is disturbing, not because it's unique, but because it probably wasn't. The specific details may be unusual. Triplets, the dramatic resemblance, the documented conspiracy, but the underlying situation was common. Plantations were places where sexual exploitation was routine, where children of mixed race were born constantly, where white families struggled to maintain the fiction of racial purity while living in intimate proximity with the people they enslaved. The horror of this story isn't supernatural, it's human. It's about the choices people make to protect themselves, to preserve their position, to maintain appearances at the cost of truth and morality. It's about a mother who loved her children enough to protect 2 of them, but not enough to acknowledge the 3rd. It's about a father who claimed ownership of everything on his plantation except the son who most needed his protection. It's about a community that chose silence over justice, secrecy over truth. And it's about a child. Samuel, the unwanted triplet, the hidden son, the boy who was too dark to acknowledge, whose life mattered less than his mother's reputation, whose existence was treated as a problem to be solved rather than a life to be valued. This mystery shows us that the darkest chapters of history aren't always about ghosts and curses. Sometimes they're about flesh and blood, about real people making terrible choices for understandable reasons, about systems that force those choices on people who were trapped within them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the archives of Henry County? Were there other children like Samuel erased from history by frightened mothers and complicit fathers? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The past is full of stories we were never meant to hear. Let's keep listening. See you in the next video.